Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me today. I'm going to be presenting on family systems of transgender youth. I have no conflicts to disclose. So the learning objectives that I'm hoping to address today are first to identify how family functioning is associated with the mental health of transgender and gender diverse youth, which I will likely use the shorthand of TGD throughout my presentation. I also hope to describe themes of relationships among TGD youth and their caregivers, and also help you understand the relevance of using a family systems approach in clinical work with TGD youth and families. So I want to start just for a couple moments with a thought exercise. I'd like you to take a moment to imagine a family with a TGD youth who you've worked with recently. And think for a moment about what are family relationships like in this family. Do family members support the trans youth? And if yes, how or what does that support look like? And how might trans youth's mental health be related to their family relationships? So I'm just going to give you about 10 or 20 seconds just to think about that for a moment. So I'd like you to just kind of keep that family in the back of your mind as a touch point during this presentation to kind of have something in mind to be able to apply some of these ideas and findings to. So jumping right in to think about the mental health of trans and gender diverse youth specifically. We have a growing body of research that indicates that transgender and gender nonconforming or gender diverse youth have higher rates of mental health concerns and risk behaviors than cisgender youth. This has been found across a range of different outcomes and behaviors, including depression, anxiety, suicidality, self-harm, use of inpatient and outpatient mental health services, substance use, and risky sexual behaviors. This slide shows the findings from a study of looking at mental health outcomes of TGD youth versus cisgender youth at an urban community health center. And as you can see from the slide pretty clearly, transgender youth are reporting higher rates of all of the outcomes: depression, anxiety, diagnoses, suicidal ideation and attempt, as well as self-harm. So how do we explain the worst mental health outcomes of TGD youth? Typically, they are explained using gender minority stress, which you've probably heard about already during this conference, and I will just very briefly talk about. And we can think specifically today about how gender minority stress may be manifesting in the school setting, as well as in the family setting. So gender minority stress theory applied to transgender individuals proposes that experiences of anti-transgender prejudice and discrimination and internalized transphobia adversely affect both physical and mental health, in part via a psychological stress response. And we can also bring in intersectionality here to think about how other systems of oppression and experiences of oppression might affect a person's experience. Data from the GLSEN 2015 National School Climate Survey indicated very high rates of adverse experiences in school settings for TGD youth. Alarmingly, 65% of youth in this sample reported verbal harassment, 75% reported feeling unsafe at school, 70% avoiding bathrooms, 56% avoiding locker rooms, and smaller but still substantial numbers reporting physical harassment and physical assault. In the 2015 US Transgender Survey of adults, 18% reported being in an unsupportive family situation. 10% had reported experiencing family violence. A bit fewer had been kicked out of their home or run away from home. So we know from the literature and also I would say from general life experience and clinical experience that family support is really critical to the well-being of all youth. And it's particularly an important protective factor for transgender and gender diverse youth. In the same study of transgender adults, 60% reported that they had a supportive family. And in a study of youth in Canada, 64% reported that they feel safe at home. So the situation is not completely dire for all transgender people in home settings, though certainly there is cause for concern for many individuals. So how does family have a protective role specifically for transgender youth? The research that has been conducted so far has indicated that socially transitioned transgender children who are supported in their gender identities have normative levels of depression, that parental support is associated with higher life satisfaction, a lower perceived burden of being transgender, and better mental health outcomes among transgender adolescents, and that transgender youth with higher levels of family support and connectedness with family report better health outcomes. So this brings us to a project that I'm going to share with you today called the Trans Teen and Family Narratives Project that I've been working on for the past 5+ years, nearly 6 years at this point. The aim of this study was to investigate how the family context affects trans and gender diverse youth's health and well-being over time, and identify types of support needed for these youth and their families. This study uses a longitudinal study design with 5 waves that were conducted across 2 years. So trans and gender diverse youth, siblings, and caregivers were interviewed and completed surveys every 6 months across 2 years. And families were recruited from organizations and clinics in New England that serve TGD youth and their families. The sample in the Trans Teen and Family Narratives Project included 33 families representing 96 family members. The sample was primarily white, with 73 to 92% of the sample reporting that race ethnicity, and 40% of caregivers had a graduate degree. The youth represented a range of gender identities. The cisgender caregivers were primarily women, and the cisgender siblings were pretty evenly split between girls and boys. So I just want to point out up front with this sample that one of the limitations is the lack of racial ethnic diversity as well as socioeconomic status diversity in this sample. So it's important, I think, to keep that in mind as we're moving forward. This project used an explicit community-based participatory research approach. If you are not familiar with this approach, it involves community in all or as many steps of the research process as possible. And it's particularly useful for marginalized populations such as trans youth and families. In the current project, we engaged the community in a number of ways. We had community partners who were identified at the beginning of the project, who worked with us throughout the project and continue to work with us. We also engaged a number of existing community advisory boards, as well as individual transgender youth and parent caregiver stakeholders. I wrote a paper about the process of doing this type of research with trans youth and families, which is the citation that you see here. And this table is from the paper and just shows you kind of the range of organizations and clinics that I connected with during the first year of the project to engage the community. So the research question that I want to share with you today that we used this data to answer is really thinking about what is the mental health of trans and gender diverse youth in this community-based sample, and how is family functioning associated with TGD youth's mental health. And we use the survey data from all family members at wave 1, so the first time they did the surveys for this particular analysis. So this slide shows the youth's report of their own mental health at wave 1 in this study. And you can see that 30% reported having suicidal thoughts, nearly a quarter had a suicide plan, 15% had attempted suicide at some point, nearly half had engaged in self-harm, and 61% had a clinically significant depression score. So I have to say, when we first started analyzing these data, I was quite surprised with these results, because these are families, or these are youth who are in a family setting that is supportive enough for the youth to participate, for the family to participate in the study together. So these numbers felt quite high to me. And from the caregiver's perspective, 17% of caregivers reported having a youth with a self-injury disorder, 40% had a youth with a depression disorder, and 48% had a youth with an anxiety disorder. And we might guess that these numbers might be a little bit high if we think about youth who haven't necessarily been diagnosed or have symptoms of these disorders that are below the threshold for diagnosis, but still are causing problems with functioning. So what was the relationship between family functioning and trans and gender diverse youth's mental health? Well, we found that trans and gender diverse youth who reported better family communication and higher family satisfaction also reported better mental health and higher self-esteem and resiliency. So this is the pattern that we hoped to find, and it essentially provides some empirical evidence that there is an association between family functioning and mental health for trans youth. Interestingly, we found that caregivers and siblings' reports of family functioning were not related to the trans youth's mental health. So this tells us two things. One, that transgender youth and caregivers and siblings have different perceptions of what's happening in the family. And also that transgender youth's own perception of family functioning is what appears to be most relevant for their mental health. So to summarize very briefly, transgender youth in this sample have pretty alarming rates of mental health concerns, and better family functioning from the transgender youth's perspective was associated with better mental health outcomes among transgender youth. And I'm just going to do a quick time check here. Okay. So what is the impact on the larger family system? So far I've essentially been talking about what's the impact of the family on the transgender youth specifically, but what's going on in the larger family system in general? Here, I think it's useful to bring in family systems theory sort of within the larger ecological systems theory. Family systems theory proposes that family members are interdependent, that individual experiences must be considered within the functioning of the larger family system, and that a transition for one family member challenges the entire family system. So when family systems theory was first developed, transition did not refer to gender transition. It often referred to other life transitions, such as a death in the family, move, divorce, changes like that. But I think it's very applicable as well to gender transition, and thinking about how when one family member undergoes a gender transition, it affects the entire family system. And kind of bringing in ecological systems theory, it's also important to recognize how the family context itself is situated within these larger contexts, the community context, as well as the societal institutional context. And here we might think about part of the societal institutional context being perhaps the socio-political climate that we're living in right now, for example, or the particular community that a person is living in, and how supportive they are toward transgender individuals. So this brings us to the Trans Youth Family Study, or TYFS as we call it for short. The aim of this study was to explore identity development and family relationships among TGD youth and their caregivers. And this study just had 2 waves across 1 year. So participants completed interviews and surveys once and then again 6 months later. And the participants in the study were trans and gender diverse youth and their caregivers. And this was a multi-site study, so participants were recruited from support networks in Northeastern, Southern, and the Midwestern US. The 2IFS sample included 20 families representing 54 family members. Similarly to the TTFN sample, this sample was also largely white race ethnicity with a similar number of caregivers who had a graduate degree. The trans youth in this sample also represented a number of gender identities, and the cisgender caregivers were primarily women in this sample. So the research question that I wanted to talk about today was how transgender youth and caregivers describe their relationships within the family. And to look at this, we analyzed the Wave 1 qualitative interview data from transgender youth and caregivers. So we found 3 different kind of buckets or categories of themes related to relationships. The first was related to the youth caregiver relationship. The second themes were related to the relationship between caregivers in families that had more than one caregiver participate. And the third kind of family of themes or category of themes was related to contextual factors kind of outside of the family that affected family members' relationships with each other. And we just got this paper accepted recently, and so it will be out soon. And I'm happy to share it with anyone who's interested once it comes out. So the first themes that I wanted to describe were themes related to the youth caregiver relationship. And we identified 3 different themes in this area: closeness, movement to acceptance, and conflict. And the first theme was closeness, and I'm going to give you some illustrative quotes to help illustrate these themes. So closeness was a theme across a majority of the interviews, wherein youth and caregivers alike described the youth's gender identity development as a catalyst for closer, more communicative relationships. And alongside this, some youth described differing levels of closeness with different caregivers. So this is a quote I want to share with you from a 15-year-old trans boy in this sample. And he said, "With my mom, I think it's gotten us a little closer, but because we have deeper conversations and we talk more. But with my dad, it's like there's a mini elephant in the room. Not like a huge one, but just a little one." The second theme was movement to acceptance. Several caregivers, typically fathers, described a sort of adjustment period after learning about their child's gender identity. And one father of an 8-year-old self-identified girlish boy talked about renegotiating the gendered context of his relationship with his child. And this father said, "I think any parent would have to say there's some level of disappointment. I think you develop expectations of, this is what I want to do with my child. And again, there are stereotypical girl things, there are stereotypical boy things, and wanting to share those with your child. You have to find different things that you can share together. So there's an adjustment period there and probably a continuing adjustment." And the third theme within the youth caregiver relationship category was conflict. Participants described conflict in this relationship arising in contexts in which the caregiver attempted to police the youth's gender presentation. For example, limiting the kinds of clothes that they can wear or how their hair is styled, or restricting access to gender-affirming care. When caregivers failed to accept the youth's gender identity over time, it often caused critical roadblocks in the youth's access to gender-affirming care. And an 18-year-old trans boy described this situation. He said, "People would ask me, 'Oh, are you on testosterone?' And I'd have to explain to them, 'No, my dad doesn't accept my gender identity.'" So now moving on to talk a little bit about themes related to the caregiver-caregiver relationship. And these included proactivity between caregivers, discordance in parenting, and support. The first theme was proactivity between caregivers. In families in which the caregivers included mothers and fathers, mothers were often more proactive about accessing gender-affirming services for their child compared to fathers. One mother of a 16-year-old trans boy talked about this. She said, "I'm still more proactive. I'm the one who did the name change, went to court. I took him for his social security card. So none of that would be done had it been left to my husband. But again, to me, that's just kind of the man-woman thing. I don't know, I just take charge." The second theme was discordance in parenting. Differences in parenting often emerged when one caregiver was prepared to affirm the child's gender identity, while the other caregiver was still adjusting to the identity disclosure. One mother of a gender-fluid 9-year-old boy talked about this discordance in her relationship with her partner. She said, "At the time, my husband and I had very different ideas on how to raise a child like this. It was one opinion against another opinion, as easy as that. That became very troublesome for many different reasons. We weren't giving each other support because we didn't believe what the other one thought we should do, and so we were at constant odds about how to even address a child like this." And sort of on the other end of the spectrum, we also saw a lot of support between caregivers. Caregivers often relied on each other for support, especially when disclosing their child's gender identity to extended family members. And one mother of an 8-year-old trans girl described this. She said, "We would be going to see my family and I would be freaking out. I'd get real stressed out and worried, like, what is this going to be like? How is this going to go? And that's where my husband would come and support me and help me through it and try to see my way through it." The third category of relationships was related to contextual factors outside of the family system that affected relationships within the family system. And these included school, extended family, and religion. School often played a critical role in family relationships, both in terms of offering support and challenges. One father of a trans boy who was 18 years old said they, the school, were really, really supportive. And I think, that helped a lot, even in the first month or two. They just set the tone, I think. On the other hand, a mother of a trans girl, age 11 years, said, "We offered a lot of professionals to come to the school and offered things to other parents if they were curious. We offered things to the teachers, and our school was just absolutely not supportive in that." The second contextual theme was extended family. Relationships with extended family also played a role in relationships within the immediate family system. One mother of an 8-year-old girlish boy described a fight that she had with her own father, the child's grandfather, about her child's gender identity. She said, "My dad said, 'I just don't understand. At what point are you going to make him play with gender appropriate toys?' So I just lost it, and I just said, 'This is who he is. This is what he likes to play with, and I'm not going to tell him that it's wrong.' My husband said to me, 'I've never heard you yell at anyone like that. I've never seen you have a fight. It was the biggest fight of my life.'" And finally, participants described the contextual factor of religion. Several trans youth identified religion as an influence in their lives. For one 17-year-old trans boy, his religious community provided support after the social transition to his gender identity. Recalling a positive experience at a weekend conference with his faith community, he said, "The kids that go to them, they kind of practice radical acceptance. Oh my gosh, you're different. That's the best thing ever." And I should note that there were also negative experiences with religious communities, but I think it's important to sort of highlight the positive experiences because I think often we only hear about the negative side when we're thinking about religion. So the summary here from the Trans Youth Family Study was that family relationships are complex with differing levels of closeness and conflict, that contextual factors from outside of the family really affect relationships within the family, And the themes really highlighted the importance of healthy relationships among family members for trans and gender diverse youth's well-being. So there were a number of limitations to this research. The families in the Trans Teen and Family Narratives Project were only from New England and primarily from Massachusetts, so this was a geographically limited project. The Trans Youth Family Study did not include the sibling experience, which we found to be really critical in the Trans Teen and Family Narratives Project in kind of helping to flesh out what was happening in the whole family system. Families in both of these studies were largely supportive. They were supportive enough to participate in research together, although with some caveats. They were not always supportive initially. Many parents, as well as siblings, described not being supportive when they first found out about their child or sibling's gender identity. And there was a lot of nuance in what the support looked like. Different family members had different perceptions of what support looked like. One parent or caregiver might perceive that they were being very supportive, but it was not perceived that way by their transgender child. And sometimes one caregiver was supportive, but another one wasn't. So at times in both of these projects, we had caregivers who didn't participate in the study because they didn't support their child's gender identity. So I just wanted to sort of give those caveats because I think it is a little bit more complex than just these families were largely supportive. Although yes, this does not represent the experiences of trans youth who are in families that are not at all supportive or don't have any family members who are supportive, which is certainly the case for some people. And these studies were also both, the samples were primarily white with higher caregiver education. So we can't really draw any conclusions from these studies for the experiences of families, of more diverse families with different race ethnicities other than white, with lower SES. I think we really need a lot more research on family experiences in those families to be able to understand whether these findings extend to those families' experiences or not. So what are the implications of this work for clinical practice with trans and gender diverse youth and their families? This is why you are all here, right? I think most of you are clinicians in the audience. So how does this relate to clinical practice? So I want you to just take a moment to revisit the family that you imagined at the beginning and think about how might these findings inform your work with this family or with families in general with trans and gender diverse youth. And I'll present to you some of my ideas about this, but I want you to first think about like what do you connect with in what I presented, and how do you think it might inform your work? So I'm just going to pause for a moment to let you think about that. Okay. So some of the things that I have come up with are this. We know from this research that transgender and gender diverse youth's perceptions of family functioning have the greatest impact on their mental health in comparison to other family members' perceptions of family functioning. So I think this translates into really involving the whole family and supporting trans and gender diverse youth. Yes, the whole family needs to be involved, but within that, still prioritizing the trans and gender diverse youth's own perspective, because that is what will have the most direct impact on their own mental health. These findings also suggest that trans and gender diverse youth's identity development and gender transition really affects the whole family and indicates that support is needed for all family members. Because different family members have different perceptions of family functioning and support, it's really critical that the support for these different types of family members is specific to each type of family member. Trans and gender diverse youth might need really different support from caregivers and from siblings. And this research also indicates that families with trans and gender diverse youth are affected by the community and societal context outside of the family. And this really speaks to the need for all of us to educate people about trans and gender diverse youth and their families, as well as advocating for these youth and families in the school systems, as well as local, state, and federal policies. So these are some of the implications that I've come up with, but I'll be interested to hear during the Q&A what you all are thinking about as well, and how you think this might apply to your clinical work. So I brought a couple cases for us to think about, and I know that this is not going to work the same as it might work in person, where people can actually verbalize their questions, or on a different kind of webinar. So I encourage you to share your thoughts in the chat for this part of the presentation. So the first case that I'm going to present to you, and I want to say first, the two cases that I'm presenting are composite cases drawn from qualitative interviews from the Trans Teen and Family Narratives Project. They represent characteristics from multiple families rather than a single family to help preserve the confidentiality of the study participants. So here's our first case. Here's the background. This is a male identified assigned female trans teen, age 15 years, who's white. This teen recently started using they, them pronouns around their trans friends and thinking about being more non-binary than male. The older sibling in the family thinks that the trans teen's coming out was a cry for attention in the household. And the mom supports the teen's medical transition after initially calling it a phase, saying, "I've always wanted a son." And the trans teen has come in because they want to talk with a medical provider about lowering their dosage of testosterone. So some of the questions I'd like for us to think through together. How might family dynamics influence the teen's decision to discuss hormone treatment with their medical provider? What are some of the stressors and sources of support for the teen? And how do family dynamics impact the health and well-being of trans teens inside and outside of the clinic? So I'm going to go put the case back up, and I'd love for you to contribute in the chat, and Virginia's going to help us by kind of reading out some of your responses. So Virginia, I will leave it to you to read out any responses that come up here.
Yes, I'll go ahead and post the questions as well in the chat box, so you can be looking at the case and the questions as you're formulating your answers, and anytime you're able, please chat your answers in the chat box.
Yes, we're having to be a little creative in this new virtual conference world, so we'll see how this goes. So I'd love to know, what are some of your initial thoughts about this case? How would you approach treating this teen if this person came to your office for care?
Okay, we have some activity in the chat here.
Great.
The first person says, I'm a licensed therapist and work in an outpatient behavioral services clinic in a rural-ish community in North Carolina. I have thought about doing a group for LGBTQ youth, but have no idea how to reach kids who have not come out to their families. So I'm seeing that this might be a question for the Q&A. So I don't know if that's something we want to just, I can hold on to that one.
Let's hold on to that one.
Yeah, and so regarding the case specifically, we have a person saying, in this case, I'm thinking about the ways that this kid may feel pressured to identify as male to the family.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say especially since the mom seems to have kind of really embraced the teen identifying as male. rather than non-binary.
Another person says, thinking a lot about the teen's non-binary identity and the mother's acceptance, but more on a binary.
Yes, exactly, exactly. So the non-binary part of this teen's identity might be kind of causing them the most stress or providing more of a barrier to acceptance here.
A person says, I would ask the teen, what do they want from T and how they currently perceive their gender?
So thinking about the dosage part of it, kind of getting what are their goals for taking testosterone? What do they hope will happen in affirming their gender?
And this person says, I would ask the person or the parent what about always wanting a son means for them and explore that as well.
Absolutely. So I think that's kind of speaking to giving the caregiver a specific kind of support here that's perhaps pretty different from what the teen needs.
And here someone says, initial thoughts are that even though mom is on board, there's still an enforcement of binary. If you can't be my daughter, well, I'm glad you are my son because I've always wanted a boy.
Yeah, absolutely. So a number of people are thinking about the non-binary stigma specifically and how that might be even more important for the mom to accept.
Someone's commenting on the stressors. Teen may not want to disappoint the mother who wants a son and may agree to treatments that are not appropriate. Teen may feel anger or resentment towards sibling and may also want to prove to the sibling that they are not faking anything and may also feel pushed towards inappropriate treatments.
Absolutely. So kind of feeling these pressures from multiple sources in the family and also maybe thinking about how different relationships might look different in this family, right? The teen and siblings relationship might look really different from the mom and trans teens relationship or the mom and siblings relationships as well.
Someone says, I would ask the teen to help me understand what they hope to accomplish by lowering the dose of testosterone.
So getting at their gender transition goals here as well. Do they want to appear more non-binary, perhaps, since they're sort of leaning toward that in their identity?
A person says, it's interesting that the youth is comfortable using they-them pronouns around friends, but not family. I think that's indicative of where we are culturally, i.e. that younger generations are increasingly more understanding of non-binary identity.
Yes, absolutely. Actually, one of the things that I failed to mention on this slide about family systems theory and ecological systems theory that I usually say is that the larger societal institutional context is also tied in with the historical context, and we have to think about what's happening now that was different 10 or 20 years ago, what's happening generationally with youth, and what does it feel like for a teen to be with other youth versus with adults, and is there more or less acceptance? So those are really important things to consider. Maybe one more comment about this one, and then I have another case for us.
Sure, there are quite a few comments in the chat. I'll read out one more.
Great.
I'm also curious about their goal to lower T. Is this coming from themselves or maybe feeling like they're nervous to stand out or get negative attention for T given sibling reaction?
So maybe thinking about responses within the family to their gender expression, and also potentially responses at school as well. That's really interesting. Thank you all for engaging with me on the chat for this case. I'm gonna give us another one here. Okay, so here's our second case. This is a female identified assigned male trans teen, age 16 years old, Asian American race ethnicity. This teen lives with their dad and grandmother in a rural town. After the 2016 presidential election, family members have frequently fought over politics in the household. In this household, Dad voted for Donald Trump and supported an anti-trans bathroom bill in their state, saying it's not for people like you, it's for the weirdos, the bearded ladies. This was an actual quote, by the way, from a caregiver in our study. And the grandmother voted for Hillary Clinton in that election and adamantly supports the teen's gender identity. And this teen presents with depression and anxiety and talks specifically about harboring resentment toward her father. So the questions I want us to consider for this case are, how might the differing political opinions of family members impact the mental health of the trans teen? What social support might be available for this teen, and what stressors are present, and in what ways could providers help support the trans teen and promote overall familial coherence for this person. So I'll put the case back up, and feel free to put your thoughts in the chat about how you might approach this one.
And I just put the questions in the chat. I realized that last time I was posting the case description. I apologize for that. You'll see in the chat now, the questions are available to you.
Great, thanks, Virginia. So how might folks approach this one?
Someone has asked, I'm curious about the Asian culture influences. Who holds more power, dad or grandma?
Interesting. Yeah, and we also don't actually know in this particular case whether this youth is adopted or not. So they could hold a different race ethnicity from their dad and grandmother as well. What are other people thinking about here?
Okay, a few more comments here. I'm curious about the rural town. Are dad's sentiments being echoed in school and around town or by peers?
So thinking about the specific community that they live in, is it more conservative leaning because it's rural potentially? And might that be showing up elsewhere outside of the family?
Another person says, I think providers could help both the trans teen and the dad, specifically with communication. It sounds like dad isn't understanding the perspective of his daughter and seeing what his actions communicate to her.
Absolutely. So focusing in on the communications piece.
Someone else says, I would love to talk with the grandmother and find out if there is something in the specific Asian culture of the family that supports gender diversity.
Yeah, so we know the grandmother is the support person here, right? Interesting.
Another person comments, it seems like dad is struggling with a dissonance between actually loving and supporting his daughter, but not seeing that others who he speaks about include someone who he knows personally and loves. I wonder if there is work to build empathy and perspective taking for dad. Are any areas that dad, grandma, and daughter can find common ground on a more personal level?
Absolutely. So part of it maybe is some education for dad around what the potential impact might be of these kinds of statements, and maybe recognizing his daughter as part of the larger trans community more broadly. And I agree also about kind of finding common ground between the three family members as well.
The next two comments are related to being in a rural area. One person says, being in the rural area, how much exposure to transgender and gender diverse persons have they had? And another person says, support may be limited in a rural setting. I would connect them to online resources. could be potential safety concerns related to the location and the patient's gender expression.
Absolutely. Yeah. So thinking about potentially more conservatism or more transgender stigma in a rural town. And then also, I think bringing in the online support piece is really critical as well.
Another person says that the patient might feel that the father really doesn't support her transgender identity if he feels that others who identify as transgender are, quote, weirdos.
Absolutely.
And there's a comment regarding question 1 where it says, we should clarify that supporting an anti-trans bathroom bill is not just differing political opinion, it's negating the humanity of gender diverse people. And the teen is hearing that.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, because those rights specifically apply to the teen.
Another person says, I'm wondering if they're already transitioning or will be. The political landscape could make them more hesitant and hopeless in pursuing medical transition due to social stigma.
Yes, absolutely. And thinking also about the age of this person, right? They're 16, so to access gender affirming medical treatment, they would have to have consent from dad, or potentially from the grandmother if she's also a legal guardian, but that could play in here as well.
Another person says, I'm thinking about the stress of the teen being continuously exposed to debates between family members, especially when at times it may include a discussion of their own identity validity.
Absolutely. So the general stress of fights about politics and how that specifically applies to their identity or what the implications are for their identity.
Another comment is around discussing decrease in suicidality with decreased discrimination. I would try to see teen alone to discuss feelings and work with mental health provider to engage dad. Ultimately, I will sometimes say, let's keep it together until 18 years old.
So kind of narrowing in on what is the teen presenting with here? They're presenting with depression and anxiety, and does that are there concerns about potential self-harm or suicidality as well?
This person says, the discord in the family may impact the teen's perception of family function. One caregiver is more affirming. I wonder if both caregivers would agree to an affirmation plan for the home and possibly in the school/community.
Interesting. I love the idea of an affirmation plan. I'd love to hear more about that in the Q&A. I think we have time maybe for 1 or 2 more comments on this case.
Okay. Another comment is, it seems like it would be helpful for dad to have someone to talk to, not in front of his daughter, to work through some of his thoughts. While I think some family therapy might be helpful, I would also want to help find dad support outside support, therapy, other parents, whatever, so that he doesn't have to burden his daughter with conflicted feelings.
Yes, absolutely. So really speaking, again, in this case, to the unique needs of support for different family members, and dad, I think, does need really clearly different types of support than the youth needs here, and might benefit from getting that support separate from the youth. Let's have one more comment on this one.
This one says, I would encourage client to come up with some concrete boundaries related to her relationship with dad.
So kind of helping the teen come up with some tools for kind of redefining boundaries and relationships as well. Yeah, that's great. Thank you for engaging with me on this case. We, during the course of the longitudinal study, ended up adding in some questions specifically about the political climate, which is where this case comes from, and have just finished writing a paper about how the socio-political climate following the 2016 election affected trans youth and families. And I'm also working on a new study coming up about how the upcoming election is affecting families as well. So this is a very relevant topic to what is going on right now in our world. So I'm glad we had a little bit of time to think through this. So just to sort of close this portion by acknowledging some of the funding sources that have funded this work, in part because this is community-based, community-engaged research, we have many, many different collaborators and community partners who've been involved, as well as a pretty large staff on this project as well. And thanking the participants especially. So I've put my, my email up here, but I think we have about 10 minutes for Q&A, and then I'll also be holding a Q&A session later this afternoon at 5:15 if you want to come and talk to me or don't have a chance to ask your question in this next segment.
Thank you, Dr. Katz for that wonderful presentation. As was mentioned, you can use the chat box to put your questions in. Right now, we'll get to as many as we can. And as Dr. Katz mentioned, if we aren't able to answer any of the questions, you're welcome to join us at 5:15 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for an additional Q&A, or you can connect through Dr. Katz email, which is up, or through our website platform. So we'll get started.
Screen shared, is it? Or
you can stop it.
Okay.
Your email is in the chat currently. So, we'll go ahead and get started with the first question. This is a little bit of a longer one, so I'll read it through. If you need me to repeat that, that's fine. So this person says, I have been providing parent and family counseling with several parents who are struggling specifically with the way their children understand and explain their gender identity. It seems that these parents are really wanting their kiddos to be able to use abstract language or more internal, nuanced language or understandings of gender in order to be comfortable affirming them. For example, a teen who is focused on the labels of terms and flags to explain their experience or are expressing age-appropriate understandings of gender more connected to expression roles and norms. Like an elementary schooler who says, I hate dresses, I like being a boy because boys are cool. I'm wondering about your work with these families to help parents shift to a more developmental frame and how to teach parents how to join these discussions rather than confusing or overwhelming their kids.
That's a great question. And I definitely would focus here on the developmental frame, right? I think that parents might need, in some cases, some education around child development, adolescent development, what's going on with brain development. A lot of kids and adolescents, especially if they're younger kids, don't have the language or don't have the capacity to be able to think in abstract terms like that. So it's really asking them to think beyond what they are capable of thinking. And similarly, during adolescence, their brains are also still developing, and the way that they understand their gender is also something that might evolve over time as well. So I think it's important for us to think about, and also for us to help parents understand that this isn't necessarily a one-time thing. That the way that someone thinks about their gender at age 3 or 4 might look different when they're 15 or 16, when they're 25, when they're 40. It's not necessarily something they might always think of themselves as a boy or as a man, but their understanding of what that means is going to evolve over time. So I think maybe helping set parents' expectations for what is a child or adolescent going to be able to understand at their developmental stage about their gender, as well as how are they going to be able to explain it to others. And younger kids might just not have the language to be able to do that yet in the way that a parent wants them to.
Thank you. So we'll go back to the question from the licensed therapist. I'm going to read that again. I'm a licensed therapist and work in an outpatient behavioral services clinic in a rural-ish community in North Carolina. I have thought about doing a group for LGBTQ youth, but have no idea how to reach kids who have not come out to their families or have families who are not accepting. I have thought about having a depression group, but I have referral sources target LGBTQ, but that feels unethical. Is it even possible to do something like this?
I think that support groups are absolutely possible, and also really critical for these families. In my work, I have heard a lot from families how important it has been to connect with other families with similar experiences. For parents in particular, to be able to connect with other parents, to be able to talk through some of the feelings that might have come up around having a youth in their family who's disclosed a trans or gender diverse identity. Sometimes parents have a lot of complicated feelings that come up, and it's so helpful for them to be able to talk through other parents who've experienced similar things rather than talking to their child about it, as came up a little bit during the case reflections. And so I would really encourage you to think about how you can make that support group happen. And right now it might look like having something in an online space during COVID times, and that might also make it more accessible for youth who don't have supportive families, potentially, if they're able to find a kind of safe space to participate virtually.
Our next question is, a lot of parents bring up the idea of teens' identity being due to peer pressure. We are hearing that a lot in our gender clinic in the last several months. How would you address that with a parent or caregiver?
That's a good question. I think my belief about gender and about visibility of trans identities is that people are not adopting these identities because it's cool or because of peer pressure or influence. They're adopting these identities because of trans visibility and because there is finally the language and understanding for people to be able to say, yes, that describes my experience. This label describes my experience. So this is my belief about gender in general. And I think we have to put a lot of emphasis on what is the lived experience of these youth. Certainly adolescents and youth are undergoing development and change, as I mentioned in response to one of the other questions. And adolescents in particular are undergoing a lot of identity change and trying to figure out, where is my place in the world? Who are my people? Where do I fit in with? Who's my community? Who's not my community? And it's possible that they're going to be trying on some identities along the way. It's impossible for us to know which of those identities might stick long term. But I think if an adolescent is in really significant distress about their gender, we really have to listen to them and help parents listen to them and kind of, support and affirm them in whatever gender they're experiencing at that moment. And it might be something that's long term and it might not be, but what's most important is to support their mental health now, or when they're in distress.
I don't have another question in the chat right now. I'll just remind everyone, if you have a question, please use the chat box and I'll read it out. One just came in.
Great.
What do you make of the hype in some media and clinical circles about late onset gender dysphoria? How do you help balance kids and parents' needs versus questions?
Mm-hmm. So I think this is a similar response to the last one in the sense that I think we really have to trust children and adolescents with their own lived experience of their gender. They're the only one who truly knows what their gender is. It's impossible for me to know what anyone else's gender is without asking them and without trusting them as the expert of their own lived experience. So I think that's really critical. And I think it's also important for us to think about how gender development is not this uniform experience among everyone, and the trajectory is not the same. It's not on the same timeline. Some people, most people develop a gender identity around age 2 or 3, but that's not necessarily the case for everyone. And whatever gender they develop at that age might not be the same gender that they have later. There's a lot of variability in when people have a realization that they have a trans identity. That happens across the lifespan. And so I think we really have to be aware of the diversity of experiences and when things might might happen, and that it doesn't mean it's late onset, because there's truly no normative timeline of development around these identities.
So we'll need to stop there. It's the end of our session. We'll remind you, if you didn't get a chance to have your question answered during this Q&A session, you'll have an opportunity to join another Q&A session with Dr. Katz at 5:15 Eastern Standard Time. So please join us there, or you can connect through the platform as well. Thank you so much to our participants, and to you, Dr. Katz for your expertise, for lending us your expertise today.
Great, thanks everyone. I hope to connect with you during the Q&A. Bye.